Multi-resolution, often referred to as multires, is the first and oldest digital sculpting format. It's based on standard Catmull-Clark subdivision, but adds the ability to sculpt each level of subdivision individually, where modifications are automatically propagated to the other levels. Since multi-res has been around the longest, there are many reliable techniques and workflows built around it, especially for highly detailed sculptures. In fact, multi-res is really the only practical way to sculpt fine details in the millions of polygons. The biggest con of multi-res is its dependency on a base mesh. If your base mesh is a close approximation of the intended final shape, then multi-res will perform optimally. Like in the case of this detailed character, the base mesh is exactly what the sculpture needs, no more and no less. Catmull-Clark subdivision quadruples your poly count with each level, and that's why you want a close approximation at your base. If your base mesh is a poor approximation, then your polygonal resources will be imbalanced and sculpting will be very limited. As you can see here, trying to sculpt a tree from a sphere. Put another way, multi-res sculpting requires more planning as opposed to freeform sculpting, but when it comes to detailed sculptures, that planning offers significant reward. Multi-res is fantastic. As I mentioned, it's the oldest format, it's extremely reliable, and really the only way to practically achieve detail level like this. But this is an advanced level sculpture. We want to explore the most essential facets of multi-res, which we will do with a Suzanne monkey head. Let's hide Abe, unhide the monkey head, Alt-Q as I hover over in sculpt mode to make sure it's the active object. And the first thing to understand about multi-res is that it exists as a modifier in the generate category multi-resolution. This is an important distinction because the other formats exist only in sculpt mode. As a modifier, it's inherently less destructive. Multi-res is based on Catmull-Clark subdivision, so let's remind ourselves by adding a generate subdivision surface modifier. It's the same math, but the limitation with regular subdivision is that we have no controls over the subdivision levels themselves. We only have control over the base mesh. There's no way to make tweaks at level 2 or level 3. And so the power of multi-res is that we do have control over those levels. So there's a lot going on in this modifier, but like most things in Blender, we'll probably use 20% of the settings 90% of the time. We'll just start at the top with the levels. And here we have control over the context of our subdivision levels, but we need levels to see how that works. So let's hit subdivide, let's say 3 times. And I am in sculpt mode, so we only saw subdivisions go up in sculpt and render. The viewport is object mode. So if we jump over there, that's set to 0. And where this is helpful, if we go back to the Abe bust, is if I'm sculpting Abe's face, I'm going to want the maximum detail. And so that's set to the highest level of 6. It can go higher, but in this sculpture, 6 is enough. But then when I want to create the clothing, for example, or modify anything else, I jump to object mode and I don't need to waste those resources by seeing the full resolution of the sculpture. So our level viewport can be lower. When it comes to the render level, typically you want that to be the highest as well, especially if the camera is close to our subject. But if our subject is mid-level or background, then we can change that to a lower level as well and save resources during the rendering process. So it's nice to have context control. Now below that, we have a checkbox called Sculpt Base Mesh. It's grayed out and only available, switching back to Suzanne, in sculpt mode. So let's select Suzanne, jump to sculpt mode. And what's important to understand about a modifier, like any modifier, is that the input mesh or the base mesh is independent from what's happening in the modifier. So in sculpt mode, if I pull out the mouth really far, make a substantial change, tab into edit mode, it's the same base mesh that we started with. So these changes are only happening in the modifier, not to the base mesh. And so if we tab back to sculpt mode, these sculptural changes are still there and they're being propagated to our other levels until we get to 0 when it goes back to the base mesh. Speaking of propagation, this is the core power of the modifier. So I'm going to come back to that. But sculpting of the base mesh, if we enable that, then it will affect the base mesh. And so if we pull out the ear, tab into edit mode, that change has been propagated to the base level, but it can get a little confusing because the mouth change happened before we enabled that. So practically speaking, you probably want to enable this at the start of your sculpting session. Now, I casually mentioned the propagation of sculpting changes through the levels, but that is critically important. Let's go back to Abe, Alt-Q as we hover over his head, and it'll take a moment since it's such a dense mesh. I'll go into local view. Now, let's say that at this point in the sculpture, I've added all the high frequency details, but I've started to realize that my proportions are a little bit off. And let's say the jaw is too high and it needs to come down. What's nice about multi-res is being able to jump down to a lower level. Let's go down to level 3, and I can pull the jaw down. And then when I jump back up to level 6, we should have seen those changes propagate. So I was afraid of this because I think there's a bug at the moment, or an oversight on how this is supposed to function. Because for many years, we didn't have this sculpt base mesh setting, and so all of our changes always propagated. However, the way it is now is it reverts and doesn't propagate unless you sort of trick it in a weird way, which is by, let's go down to level 3 and repeat this. All right, so you just saw me pull the jaw down. I'm going to do that again. Now, those will not propagate if I jump up the levels, but if I tab into edit mode, those changes are not propagated here because I have disabled sculpt base mesh. But now when I tap back to sculpt mode, the jaw will be propagated up the levels. And so that's a really funky bug that's going on at the moment, in that it hasn't worked that way for many years, probably a decade. But if the bug doesn't go away, it can be solved by always having sculpt base mesh on. All right, let's move on to optimal display, is how the wireframe is viewed. So if we turn on the wireframe, this should be the base mesh. I don't know why it's not. All right, 4.2 beta giving me a little bit of trouble. Let's try it with Suzanne instead. Alt-Q. Switch over to make Suzanne active, and yeah, optimal display is working over here. It could be that Abe came from a previous version of Blender, but anyway, that is what optimal display is supposed to do. If you turn it on, it only shows the base mesh's wireframe incorporated into the sculpting changes. Next, in the subdivision section of our modifier, we have the subdivide button, which we've been pressing for adding your typical subdivision smooth levels. Now, for these other two options, we're going to use a cube. So I'll jump to object mode, mesh, add a cube, add a multi-res modifier, and disable optimal display. So if I subdivide with simple a few times, it seems to keep the base shape and simply increase the polygon count. All right, so we don't get any of that smooth interpolation of the shape inherent to the regular subdivide. So if we undo that and do the same thing with linear, they're going to look the same. However, in order to see a difference, I'm first going to subdivide one level so we get a little bit of that smoothing. And now watch what simple does. All right, so it seems to detect the sharpest of the edges, which in this case is the original cube edges, and it maintains a sharpness but smooths in between them. Now, I've never used this, but I think the idea is this would be helpful for hard surface sculpting rather than organic sculpting like faces, hard surface being, weapons or sci-fi crates, that kind of thing. And so perhaps simple is aimed at that compared to the linear, which is simply increasing the geometry. So again, I use subdivide 99.9% of the time. I'm not sure if I've ever used these practically, but as with many of those settings that aren't used very often, they do have a special use case. Next, we have unsubdivide and delete higher. These are more troubleshooting parameters in my experience. And I'm going to jump to another example to demonstrate this. So I have another bust here, or rather it's a torso, and we'll turn off wireframe. And let's say that this monster was sculpted in another package like ZBrush. And so the highest level of subdivision was exported and brought into Blender. And to simulate this, we will apply the multi-res modifier. So now my base mesh is this 2 million poly, super dense mesh. But remember, in this scenario, it came from ZBrush. So if we wanted to regain the multi-res subdivisions, let's add a multi-res modifier. and we can unsubdivide, and it will go down a level rather than up a level. It will probably take some time given the amount of calculations it's having to do. But it is nice that we can regain those lower subdivisions for additional sculpting if the need arises. Now this unsubdivide goes down one level at a time. There's also an option under generate that only appears if we have no levels. So let's undo that unsubdivision. And now we have no levels, and under generate, we have rebuild subdivisions, which will unsubdivide all the way down until the math doesn't work anymore. So if I press that, this will take probably 20 seconds or so. And now we have all 4 of our levels, which we remember from when we applied the modifier. Now keep in mind that this only works mathematically if it comes from a subdivision history. In other words, you can't take any arbitrary mesh and unsubdivide it. And to demonstrate this, just one simple change, if we apply again at the high res and then tab into edit mode, and if I simply cut one edge loop, and now if we try the same thing, add a modifier, multi-res, and unsubdivide, it gives us the warning, no valid subdivisions found to rebuild a lower level. So the math has to work out perfectly. And the rule of thumb is that if it comes from a subdivision history and you haven't made any edits to the mesh, then it should unsubdivide fine. Now below that, we have the delete higher. We'll go back to Suzanne for this. So I've really only used this whenever my subdivisions in the higher levels aren't really working out, right? So let's say progressively you start at level 1, you make sculpting changes, you go to level 2, make more detailed changes, level 3, so on and so forth. Well, if you find that at the higher levels, your sculpture is kind of going off the rails and not what you wanted, you can go down to level 2 or level 1 and delete the higher subdivisions. And that's it for the subdivision panel. Under the shape, we have an option called reshape. And so if I duplicate this head, jump into sculpt mode, and let's just start fresh. So we'll go all the way down to 0, delete higher, subdivide up to level 3, and we'll make some crazy change. We will be able to copy this over to an identical mesh at the same subdivision level. So if we go back, hovering over our original Suzanne, Alt-Q, and if we subdivide up to level 3, go to object mode, if we make both of these level viewport 3, and then choose reshape, it will copy those vert positions over here. And so this is really only useful with advanced workflows, or if I'm trying to regain like a previous version of the sculpture. But again, that's not a fundamental use case, but that's what the tool does. And then apply base. So this has existed long before the sculpt base mesh checkbox. And so if we tab into edit mode, interestingly, the sculpt base mesh does not seem to take the reshaping that we did. So if we wanted this to affect the base mesh, we simply apply the sculpting changes to the base, and now in edit mode, we have those changes propagated. So apply base and sculpt base mesh are kind of doing the same thing, but the checkbox does it continually. Apply base does it with each time you press it. And then below that, in the generate, you've seen that we do have that hidden parameter to rebuild subdivisions whenever there are no subdivisions, and it's a subdividable mesh. But we also have this save external. So we're able to export our subdivision levels outside of Blender. And I've never used this personally, but presumably it's useful for transferring your sculpture to another application. Below that, we have our advanced settings, which always come with subdivision in general. So we can find those same settings in the subdivision modifier under advanced. And frankly, I never change these, or maybe not never, but I have changed them before in very advanced situations, fitting for this particular dropdown. So we don't need to go over those here. That's going to do it for our overview of the multi-resolution sculpting format. Next, we'll look at the remesh workflow.